So without further ado, I would like to introduce the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, who has served as the Member of Parliament for North Vancouver since 2015. Raised in Saskatchewan, Minister Wilkinson spent more than 20 years in the private sector. He didn't ask me to say that, I promise. He did. Spent more than 20 years in the private sector, holding leadership positions with a number of companies dedicated to the development of green technologies. A Rhodes Scholar, Minister Wilkinson made use of his educational background in public policy when he worked as a constitutional negotiator and a federal provincial relations specialist for former Saskatchewan Premier Roy Romanov. He has served on several industry and charitable boards, including the United Way of the Lower Mainland and the BC Technology Industry Association. He also served as a board member and treasurer of the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Minister Wilkinson.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you today. I would start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe peoples. I also want to recognize, and I hope I don't miss folks, but some of my colleagues in the room, or former colleagues, so Richard Cannings. Richard has a long association with Species at Risk, and we actually worked together to make some changes to the Species at Risk Act and how that works a couple of years ago. And Finn Donnelly, I think, is here, former Member of Parliament. Oh, he just stepped out, okay. And again, somebody that when I was in my former role as Fisheries Minister, we did a lot of work on the protection and enhancement of wild salmon. I also just want to recognize Hannah and Cooper, who are over here with the camera on them. They are two young people who are here filming a video for YTV on climate change. They are both young people who are actively engaged in the climate issue, and these are, of course, issues that are most particularly important for young people who are going to inherit the product of the work that we do today. So welcome. As was said in the introduction, I grew up in Saskatchewan, and we used to go, my family, there were 4 kids, so I've got 3 siblings and my parents. My parents were both folks who worked in the community sector. My mom was a social worker, and my father was a community development worker. And so vacations for us were jumping into a Volkswagen van and driving to northern Saskatchewan with a couple of canoes on top, where we would drop the canoes into the water, and then we would go off and paddle through the bush for a couple of weeks. Later, when I was in high school, my father purchased a very small canoeing outfitting business on the Churchill River in Saskatchewan. And so I used to spend 4 months of the year up in the north. I don't know how many people have been in the boreal forest in Saskatchewan, but it is still a place that is largely untouched from an ecosystem perspective. There is very little industrial activity up there. It's very much a place that's still in balance. I still go back every year. It is probably the place that I feel most at home. And when I am there, I reflect very much about the work that I am doing as a politician and working in the area of environment and climate change. I want to talk to you today about 3 particularly important issues. Climate change, of course, the loss of biodiversity in this country and in this world, and pollution, most specifically plastics pollutions. These are all pretty significant challenges. There are no easy solutions to address any of them, and to find pathways to concretely address these challenges will require a lot of thought, a lot of discussion, and certainly a lot of collaboration. Climate change is very much the existential threat of our time. Before entering politics, I spent many years as a clean technology CEO and senior executive. I actually made the decision to enter politics, which I can tell you was not my wife's favorite idea, in large measure because I was concerned about climate change. And I was concerned about climate change in the same way that I think many people are, which is I have 2 kids. They are teenage daughters. And I worry a lot about the world that they will inherit. The latest UN report has indicated that human activities have already caused 1 degree of global warming. If global emissions continue to rise at their current rate, in line with commitments under the Paris Agreement, we would see about a 3-degree rise in global average temperature by 2100, which would have catastrophic effects for this world. As you will know, on average, Canada is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world and 3 times as fast in our north. We are already seeing the impacts of the warming climate through things like wildfires in Alberta and BC, devastating floods in New Brunswick and Quebec. Ce n'est pas étonnant que les jeunes descendent dans la rue pour exiger des actions concrètes. It's no wonder that young people are taking to the streets demanding concrete action. Young people question a future in which many struggle to envisage that they will have children of their own. To avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we know we need to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees. We also know that will require us to reach net zero emissions by around 2050. That's a drop of 80 to 90% in terms of the emissions that we have today. I think it's important to understand that that's not just an environmental transformation, that's a fundamental economic transformation. If you think about a future in which we are working towards those levels of emissions reductions, it means that none of us are driving internal combustion engines. And so we will need to be thinking about an economic strategy that will address that and will ensure that the world, but certainly that Canada, can continue to support economic prosperity through different alternative uses of energy. Our government made 2 key commitments during the campaign, as you will have heard. One was to exceed our 2030 targets, and the other was to achieve net zero by 2050. These targets are grounded in climate science. They are not simple, but they are grounded in science, and they need to be done. With respect to the 2030 target, I would argue that we have accomplished a lot, and I think my predecessor, Catherine McKenna, was an important part of that. Through the Pan-Canadian Framework, which was the first real climate plan that this country has ever had, we've identified about 227 megatons in reductions relative to where we would otherwise be in 2030. And that is through what's called the Pan-Canadian Framework, but it's 50 different initiatives, including the accelerated phase-out of coal, methane regulations, investments in electric vehicle infrastructure and in public transit. But much remains to be done. We are still over 70 megatons away from our 2030 goal, and our commitment was to exceed that goal. We know that we need to do more, but we know that all provinces and territories and all sectors are going to have to help with this. Certainly, nature-based solutions must be part of our plans. Research indicates that nature-based climate solutions done right can provide significant mitigation to help us achieve some of these targets. We also committed to net zero by 2050. We are not alone in that regard. 77 countries around the world have committed to that. A number of leading companies have committed to that, including a number of leading energy companies like Cenovus, CNRL, Meg Energy, and this week, Teck. Other technology companies have committed to it. You will have seen that Microsoft has now committed to be carbon negative. We will need to define pathways and timelines. We committed to standing up an expert process that would consult with sectors and with Canadians on the different pathways we can utilize to get to the net zero target. We already know much of what needs to be done. We have many of the technologies already that we need. We certainly know we need to mobilize private capital. I would tell you that the financial markets are increasingly understanding this. Many of you will have heard the statement by the BlackRock's CEO recently about the need to ensure that we are thinking through climate in the context of investment decisions. There are, though, areas where we have a need for and we will need to push for the development of new technologies. Things like, if you think about steel manufacturing, we use large amounts of metallurgical coal. How are we going to continue to make steel, which we need, in a manner that is not emitting? How can we think about the utilization of some of our existing energy resources in a way that is not polluting? We need to have a more productive conversation on climate across different regions of this country. And we need to think about the economic opportunities that can be enabled by being a first mover with respect to addressing these issues. This will be a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, but it will be one that goes to countries that actually act first. Canada has actually been a leader in clean technology for some time. This past year, we had 12 Canadian companies who were in the top 100 clean tech companies around the world. But this is something that requires focus. It requires focus not just on the part of government, but it requires critically work with private sector and private companies to ensure that we are creating an economy that will support continued prosperity in a much lower carbon future. I would say that technology is very important, but technology is not a climate strategy. This was one of the conversations that we had during the recent election campaign. A climate strategy is a climate strategy that is broad, that aims to actually address all of the sources, the major sources of carbon emissions. Technology can be an enabler, but technology in and of itself is not a strategy. There is much work to do to address the climate issue, and I would simply say that we will need your help, all of you, as we look for pathways to ensure that we succeed. The other key issue is really the decline in biodiversity. You know, you guys will be very familiar with the World Wildlife Report saying that wildlife populations have declined by 60% over the last 40 years. That is a product of climate change, no doubt, but it is also a product of habitat loss. This is also a critical, and it is also an existential threat that requires urgent action. In 2010, Canada had committed to the HE targets with a goal of achieving 10% protected spaces in the marine area and 17% in the terrestrial area by 2020. And when we assumed office in 2015, there was a long way to go. I was Minister of Fisheries when we came to office in 2015. I think we were about 1% protection. In budget 2018, we made the largest contribution to Nature Conservancy in conservation in Canadian history. It was a $1.3 billion commitment. That was something that enabled us to make enormous progress, but the success in securing those funds to be able to deploy to help us to meet those targets was in part successful because of the mobilization of private capital from many of the foundations sitting in this room that helped us to make the argument to the Finance Department and to the government more generally that government support would be leveraged by the commitment of others who also felt that biodiversity and the protection of wild spaces was extremely important. We have made enormous progress. We have overachieved our marine targets. I was very privileged to be in the north with the Prime Minister and with Minister McKenna to announce the creation of Last Ice, which brought us to, I think, 13.7% protection on a 10% target. We are on track to deliver on the terrestrial targets, if a couple of years late. We have recently added a number of important protected areas, including the Birch River Wildlands Park, Jumbo in BC, which has been an important one, has been 30 years in the making, and is, I think, an interesting model. It is an Indigenous protected area that is led by the Ktunaxa people. The Halifax Urban Wilderness Park, and of course, Talayup Imanga, which was something that was developed and implemented in partnership with the Inuit. During the campaign, we actually made further commitments, which was to achieve 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. Again, those are ambitious targets. They are not simple. And we have not fully framed out how we are actually going to achieve them. But ambitious targets are required in order to push us to ensure that we're actually moving in the right direction. And we're doing what we need to do in order to have a livable world for ourselves, but certainly most particularly for our kids. I think it's particularly important, to be honest, for Canadians, because we define, in part, our identity around wild spaces and abundant nature. Once again, with respect to finding pathways to achieving these targets, we will need your help. Nature-based solutions give us the opportunity to tackle the challenges of climate change and biodiversity at the same time. We can design our protected areas so that they sequester and store carbon while providing species habitat, recreation, and other benefits for people and for nature. We can invest in restoration that helps species adapt to climate change while reducing our net emissions. We can deploy natural infrastructure that is resilient to climate change, enhances habitat, and delivers necessary services like clean water to people. to meet the ambitious and indeed the necessary targets we set for reducing emissions and the need for economic transformation that I spoke of. And we need to deploy nature-based solutions and ensure that they are available to all of us. And finally, let me just say a couple of words about plastics. Pollution and management of waste is also an important environmental issue. Plastics are despoiling our natural environment, both from a macroplastics perspective, but also increasingly from a microplastics perspective as they degrade in the natural environment. We are taking aim at plastic waste and plastic pollution. We have spoken, and I have spoken very specifically about the need for Canada to move towards the concept of a circular economy, something that you folks will have been talking about long before me. That obviously relates to wastes far broader than plastics, but plastics is where we have chosen to start. Last week, we released a State of Science report with respect to plastics that clearly are harming our environment. That provides a scientific basis for us to move forward now in accordance with the precautionary principle to bring in a ban on harmful single-use plastics in 2021 and to move forward with the provinces and territories to address extended producer responsibility, more aggressive content requirements for recycling and recycled products, and to ensure that we are actually moving concretely down the pathway towards a circular economy. We have great challenges before us, no doubt, but we also have enormous opportunities. Through what has been done over the past 4 years, I think that we collectively, not just the government, but we collectively have demonstrated that by working together, we can indeed make significant progress. In moving forward, I am certainly looking for your partnership. The Government of Canada is looking for your partnership and for your ideas. At the end of the day, the issues that I have spoken about should not be partisan issues. These are issues of sustainability and ultimately issues of the ongoing viability of our natural world. As I mentioned earlier, I entered politics in 2015 largely because I was concerned about climate change. I was quite happy in the business community, and as I noted, I have 2 teenage daughters, and I worried a lot about their future. My youngest daughter is now 17. She's in grade 12. And she comes home when I am home. She comes home almost every day and says to me, "Dad, you're not doing enough to fight climate change." So I would say those words actually motivate me pretty much every day. I think about them a lot. I imagine that most of you have similar stories. I certainly invite you to partner with us to address and overcome our collective challenges. Our kids and our grandkids, and indeed all Canadians, are counting on all of us. Thank you very much.